Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm LaDonna, I'm your instructor. I have been teaching painting for a very long time, and I thought I would do a little video today showing just a simple technique where your colors will blend together and give you this beautiful tie-dyed effect on your flower. And you can use it with any color you like. The initial one that I did was in reds and yellows and dark burgundy. And the one I'm going to show you today, I'm using a color called Mayan blue. It's a beautiful deep azure that's kind of a Caribbean blue. It's got a little bit of a green undertone to it. And it's a little heavier pigment, so it wants to stay where I put it. And that works well for this technique because I can add lighter weighted pigments on top of it, and they're going to want to flow into it. So first off, I am loading up my brush with a nice heavy load of this paint. If you see on that paper, there's some paint sitting up on top of that paper, and it's going to allow me to float in some other colors and be able to get a great looking gradient that's really interesting when it's dry. Don't worry about all of this when it's wet because we're just going to put in the color and let that paint do its thing. So here I thought I was a little heavy on some of that blue up at the tips of my petals, so I used a thirsty brush, which means I picked up any excess moisture that was on my brush and I used it to sop up some of that extra paint on my paper. Then I picked up a little bit heavier load of the Mayan blue and dropped that right into the very center corners of my painting so it would have a little bit of depth. I'm letting that kind of set for a second and move along and do its thing. Now I've mixed up some Dioxazine purple, and this is a heavier mix. And by heavier, I mean there's more pigment per water. So because it's so heavy and thick, it's going to want to displace that water and that paint that I already have on the paper. So I drop it into the center, and because I have the correct ratio, that paint that I put on there being heavier, it will flow into and push that blue out of its way. And that is something I think that a lot of people have a difficult time comprehending. Unfortunately, with watercolor, there can be a lot of technical aspects as to with your water flow and your pigment load and the colors that you're using. Some are granulating, some are staining. But for this project, we just want to make sure that we have a nice, thick, viscous amount of purple on that brush. So it is the stronger of the two, physically stronger, and it's going to push that blue paint out of its way. Show it who's boss. So I'm just doing another flower here. I'm letting the brush shape my petals. These are very abstract random petals. We're just getting the gesture of that flower. Right here I am painting what I call my little smile. So when you look at a flower straight on and you see all 5 petals like you do in that first flower, on the second one that flower is tilted about 75%. So you're going to see the 3 petals in the back being very defined and fully formed, but that first petal and second petal in the very front, you're seeing at more of a direct, straight-on angle, so it looks more like, to me, I always think it's like a little smile, so I give my flowers a little smile. Now I'm dropping in some of that purple, and I'm mixing these colors on my palette that are on my left. I am a lefty, so I keep my colors on my left. That way I'm not crossing over in front of my painting or on top of my painting with a loaded brush, which it's always going to drip off no matter how careful I am. So I can avoid that by keeping my paint on my left-hand side because I'm left-handed. If you're right-handed, obviously you would keep your paint on your right-hand side. Now, there's a lot of paint on this paper right now. I am using specifically a 100% cotton, 140-pound paper. It is a great paper by the bee company. It's BEE, just like the insect that makes us honey. It is a medium-sized paper, so my water, part of it is sitting up on top in my paint and some of it is soaking in. So because it moves a little bit more slowly on this paint and it actually will spread out evenly because of the cotton fibers soaking it into the paper, I have a little bit more time to add in some of my color. If I were working on what I call a student grade paper, like the Canson XL or the Strathmore 300 or an Artist Loft, where it is basically a cellulose paper, which is a wood fiber, and then the sizing that they use, and the sizing is what makes your paint kind of stick around a little bit, is a starch that they spray on top. So because of the way that the paper is made, it's not going to be as even with the distribution of the water. Some of it's going to dry more quickly, some of it's going to dry a little bit more slowly, so you don't get that nice flow. I do suggest for this type of heavily applied paint and pigment that you do use a cotton paper that is got a little bit of texture to it. The 140 pound is the perfect weight, period. So there's my little flower. That's the third one. Whenever we're doing any type of a composition, you do want to work in odd numbers. So my first 3 flowers are obviously a 3. And then I'm going to add a couple of little buds. Now, even though I'm only adding 2 buds, when you combine that with the rest of the composition, it is still 5 flowers, 5 areas of color. So I'm just putting in my Mayan blue, nice and heavy, so it's actually sitting up on top of my paper, and then I'm dropping in some of that even thicker, more viscous purple. You see how it kind of moves around and does its own thing. And we're going to fill in this little empty space over here with another little bud. You can actually see how that paint is kind of sitting up like a little puddle on top of my paper. I just spread that out, change my shape a bit. Pick up some of this dark purple. Sorry, that is off frame. I will try and work on that in the future, getting everything more in frame. And I just tap that down. Now you see it's not moving and it's not as dark because I did not have a good load on my brush. I had to go back, pick up a little bit more paint that was a little bit thicker of a mix and drop that in. Now see how that's moving more readily and it's pushing that blue paint out of its way. I love the way that this kind of reminds me of a tie-dye, which is really, when you think about it, we're working on cotton paper, which is like a fabric. So it is like we are tie-dyeing this paper. You get that beautiful commingling of colors, and you get that richness, and even the subtle mid-tones where the 2 colors are mixing together. You do have to be careful. Now you'll notice on the pictures that I did that I used colors that were next to each other on the color wheel. They play well with each other. They like each other. So when they blend, I just get a little different tone of those colors as opposed to getting mud. I would not, and I repeat, would not have used green and red together, or yellow and purple together, or orange and blue together, because when those 2 colors mingle, they don't play well with each other and they are going to turn into a muddy brown. Now, even though this is a simple abstract painting, you don't want to have your flowers have brown patches in the middle so they look like they're dying. We want them to be bright and sunny and look like spring. So now I mixed up a color that's called green chromium. It's a thicker green that actually is a little bit more pigmented and a little bit more of an opaque color. I like this color for doing my stems and leaves. It is a nice olivey, natural looking green. It's not too bright. It's not too fluorescent-y. So I go and I mix up kind of a medium transparent mix of that with my water, and I'm using my number 4 round, and I'm just sweeping in very loosely some stems. I just want to connect my flowers to the bottom of my page. I don't want them to be super rigid and structured. This is not any kind of a formal arrangement of flowers or construction. So we're just putting in now, I'm using my brush. Do you see how I push my brush down and I let the shape of my brush create my leaf? My brush is fairly well loaded. These are nice Mimik Kolinsky brushes, so they have a good heavy load ability, which means that they are fatter in the middle of the brush when you look at the brush, and then they taper off to a nice point. So I can load them up with a considerable amount of paint. I make sure there again that my paint does have a good amount of pigment in it. It's not too watery, and I am not going back into my water in between each load. I'm going right into my paint that I've already mixed up on my palette, and I'm loading it up and letting that brush suck up all that nice green and all that pretty pigment. And so then I can just go right and I can onto my card, and I can do several leaves with one load of my brush. As my leaves start to get a little bit less paint on them, they get a little bit lighter and you get a nice tone differential. So all of your leaves are not the same exact color. Now I just go in and I'm just adding a few more little stems to connect my leaves. I'm leaving lots of white space in this. As you can see, that's one thing that I really enjoy with the watercolor, letting the white of your paper show through. Gives you that beautiful luminosity. It's the one thing with watercolor that you just can't get with any other medium. Now I thought I wanted a little bit more accent and definition and depth in the center of my flowers, so I reloaded my brush. This is a number 6 again, Mimik Kolinsky, and I loaded my brush up with a little bit of my purple, and I just gave a couple little sweeping gestural strokes with that purple. When it dries, it's going to dry a little bit lighter, like watercolor always does, but it's going to give me some more definition and kind of draw you into the center of those flowers. Now I wanted a little bit of brightness, so I mixed some cad yellow medium in with my chromium green, and it gave me this little bit brighter, fresher green. So I just did a few little strokes to highlight around my flowers and once again give my composition a bit more depth. It's a simple thing. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but it does add just a little bit more definition and depth to your card. So now we get to go into our favorite, the Finetec Metallic paints. These paints are amazing. The mica amount that they use to get the metallic on these paints is off the charts. I love the Finetec paints. I know they're a little bit more pricey, but they are absolutely worth every penny. So I activated my paint with some water. I let it set for a few seconds. Then I really almost aggressively activated it with my brush because I want to get beyond that surface layer of the gum arabic on that paint and down into the mica. So I'm really stirring it up, and then I load my brush quite heavily and I just give it a little tap. Because the Mimik Kolinsky is a little bit softer bristle, you get a nice little spatter. So I'm just using my fingertip to hit the end of that brush on the ferrule, and it will splatter down and give me some different sizes of gold splatter. I wanted to have a little bit more emphasis in the center of my flowers, so I did go right back into that gold and just tipped some right on top of my wet paint. The center of my flower I just tapped in very simply with a very, very dark green. So I used a color that I have on my painting palette that is called dark green, but you could use a little bit of black or Payne's gray in your chromium green, give you this very, very, very almost black green. And I just tap that in the center. You'll notice that these flowers are not a botanical study. They're not anything that is going to be, here's the center, here's the stamen, here's your calyx, here's your stem. This is a simple gesture of a flower, and the human brain is kind of trained that if it sees a blob of color with a black or dark center, it automatically translates it into a flower. So that's what we're doing here, just giving ourselves the gesture of these flowers. Now I let my painting dry. I did not use a hairdryer to dry this because I had so much pigment sitting on top of that paper and I wanted that pigment to have its chance to mingle and dry on its own. If I used a hairdryer, it would blow that pigment around and it would unsettle it. So I did take just a couple of minutes and let it air dry on its own. I wanted to add a little bit of notation on this card, a little bit of greeting. So I just wrote smile on this, and I wrote it with my mechanical pencil. I can get nice, clean, crisp lines with that, and I do like to do that first before I go in with the Micron pen. That way, if I'm a little crooked or my E is too small or I don't like something about it, I can erase it and start over. But I then just go over it with my Micron pen, which is a waterproof pen, and then I go over my little smile. Then I've used my 0.0 liner brush, and I picked up a little bit more of the gold and I highlighted on my little smile. Kind of took a look and saw if there was any extra gold I wanted to add. I didn't see it where I thought it needed any. You can kind of see how that gold just is amazing when it dries.